So
you have been called YouTube's new father figure. Your advices, they are kind of fatherly. Is that something that comes with the territory of being a psychologist, or is this your own
I would say
personal
both.
touch?
Well, it's both being a professor, at least in principle, and being a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. So I'm a hybrid of those two things. Mm-hmm. And I was also trained, like I've read deeply in the clinical literature, psychoanalytic, existential, humanist. There's all sorts of different streams of clinical thinking, all of which have something very valuable to offer, I would say. But I was trained technically as a behavioral psychologist, and one of the things that a behavioral psychologist is trained to do is to take a large problem and to break it down into units that are small enough to actually manage practically. And so I've always considered my teaching in that light, as my goal is to take high-level abstractions and to break them down until they're practically applicable. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose, so that's both educational, so that's the professorial side, and psychologically meaningful, so that's the clinical psychology side, because clinical psychologists fortify the individual. That's really their role. Mm-hmm. And to the degree that that's a fatherly role, well, partly that's a consequence of the fact that I have been a father, I still am, and that I'm of the age where that's an appropriate way of interacting with people. But it's also in the same category in some sense as, like, because the purpose of a father psychologically is to fortify the courage of his children. And so that's appropriate for me given the stage of the development of my career, for example.
You talked about the importance for people to sort out early on where they want to go with their lives. Mm-hmm. Why is this important?
Yeah, well, we've done some practical work on this too. I have this program called Future Authoring, which is part of the self-authoring suite, and it's available to everyone online. I developed with my colleagues about 15 years ago, and our goal was to produce high-quality psychological interventions for mass audiences at an extremely low cost, and to do it in a way that was least likely to cause negative consequences. Mm-hmm. So that was the framework. And the Future Authoring program helps people develop a vision for their life. And so you're asked to imagine that you were taking care of yourself properly. So you're taking responsibility for yourself, not taking the easy way out or being nice to yourself or bolstering your self-esteem or any of that, but taking responsibility for your life. And to envision who you could be, if you could be who you should be 3 to 5 years down the road, just to ask yourself, well, if I could have what I wanted and needed, and if I was acting in the world properly, what would my friendships look like? What would my intimate relationship look like? How would I conduct myself with regards to my family? I've had lots of people come to my talks and say, look, I've really been trying to put together my family. We were fragmented badly, and so I've been working for 2 years to bring everyone together, and it's really working. It's like people tell me that all the time, which is a lovely thing to hear. How should you construct your career? How should you educate yourself? You should resist temptation, like the temptation of drugs and alcohol, take care of yourself mentally and physically. Just have an image of, if the world could be set up around you, starting with you, in a way that would be best for you and for other people as well, what would that look like? Well, without that sort of vision, you don't have a target, and you don't have any hope. And like, people live on hope, and your aim gives you hope. And so the nobler your aim, the more hope you have, and you need hope, especially during times of catastrophe. And so it's extremely necessary for people to consider their character development, because that's actually what sustains them through the difficulties of life. And it seems as if we've either never knew this in our education system or have forgotten it completely. And we can't forget that, because that's actually the purpose of education. The purpose of education is the development of character. It's not mastery over a set of facts, even though there's some utility in that mastery. If the facts are dead, if they're just lying there and they're not given life by being integrated into a noble narrative, let's say, then they're of no utility. They might even be harmful. So, and we've done research. If university students do the Future Authoring program, it decreases the probability they'll drop out of school by about 30%, and it seems to have a particularly large effect on underachieving men. And we're not sure exactly why that gender differential exists, but it might partly be because in the main, women are outperforming men in academic environments. And so these programs seem to boost the performance of the lower performers. But it also might be that men in particular won't engage in the world properly unless they have their own aims.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why do you think men are underachieving or not living up to their full potential?
I think part of it is the contamination of competence with tyranny. Is that if every time you turn around, when you're attempting to win a competition, for example, or take your place in the world, the implicit or explicit accusation is that you're exercising tyranny and participating in an oppressive patriarchy, and there's something wrong with you ethically for doing so. It's an invitation to the weak part of your character to take over. It's like, well, why should I try to do anything when everything I do is criticized? And when I'm regarded, and it's not only that, because like I've met many men who've really believed that their ambitions to take their place in the world are part of the oppressive patriarchal structure that's responsible for the dispossession of the dispossessed and the destruction of the ecological landscape, and that their best bet was just to do nothing, just to sit there and do nothing, because at least then they'd be harmless, as if harmlessness is the highest possible goal. But if everything is oppressive power and that's wrong, then powerlessness is the most impressive goal. But there's no life in that. So I'm going to sit here and be harmless. It's like
has become a mainstream view. I feel like. What do you think? Is this taken over completely?
There's certainly no shortage of pressure to make it become the mainstream view. Well, this is where I think too the universities play a terrible role, because the universities have facilitated the development of these activist disciplines, women's studies probably foremost among them, but social work, anthropology, often English literature has become completely corrupt. Law is heading in that direction. And you have 1/5 of social scientists identifying themselves as Marxists, which I think is beyond reprehensible given the history of Marxism. And this patriarchal, what would you say, this conceptual scheme that insists that Western cultures are fundamentally oppressive patriarchies has become not only like holy writ in the universities, but is spilling out into the mainstream with incredible rapidity. And it's an absolutely horrible doctrine.